Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you for this special SUNY Honorary Degree Conferral ceremony. And I'd like to thank Ms. Eunice Lewin, a member of the State University of New York Board of Trustees, for joining us for today's conferral. On behalf of the entire UB community, I would like to offer a warm welcome to our distinguished guest, Sir David Adjaye, OM, OBE. Mr. Adjaye, while we certainly would have liked to honor you in person, we are pleased to have this occasion to recognize you as our university's newest SUNY Honorary Degree recipient. These honorary degrees, proposed by our campus and authorized by the SUNY trustees, are conferred on individuals like you who represent the highest ideals of the University at Buffalo. Through your innovative contributions to architecture and design and your prolific scholarship on these subjects, you have distinguished yourself as a global leader in your profession and beyond. The prestigious accolades you have received throughout your career, including the Royal Gold Medal for Architecture, speak to the high esteem in which you are held among your peers. Your groundbreaking work, from the National Museum of African American History and Culture to the Moscow School of Management to the Nobel Peace Center, among many notable examples, has tremendously influenced your field. At the same time, your career serves as a source of great inspiration for our faculty and students in the School of Architecture and Planning. As an advocate for equity and inclusion, you embrace values our university holds dear. Moreover, in using your platform to promote these values, you are furthering a conversation that is of critical importance to us as a scholarly community as we seek to dismantle structural barriers to equity. Your extraordinary talents, your deeply affecting work, and your advocacy on behalf of social and racial justice resonates with the mission and vision of our university and our system. In recognition of the impact your work has had on our world, and in appreciation for the inspiring example you set for our students, faculty, and staff, and the University at Buffalo is privileged to confer upon you, on behalf of the State University of New York, an honorary doctorate in humane letters. At this point, I invite Trustee Lewin to confirm the State University of New York honorary doctorate.
By the authority of the trustees and the Chancellor of the State University of New York, and the Council and the faculty of the University at Buffalo, I now confer upon Sir David Frank Adjaye, OM, OBE, the degree of Doctor of Humane Letters, honoris causa, with all of the rights and privilege thereto pertaining. In token thereof, he will be presented a diploma and hood appropriate to that degree. Congratulations, Sir David Adjaye.
Dr. Adjaye, would you like to make some remarks?
I'm deeply humbled by this honor. Thank you so much. It's always incredible to hear one being described by another person, and it's very humbling that you've recognized work that I've been doing. I'm just deeply grateful. Thank you.
Thank you and congratulations, Mr. Adjaye. As our conferral ceremony concludes and we transition to the discussion with Mr. Adjaye, I would like to welcome our participants, Bob Shibley, Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning, and Charles Davis, a UB alumnus and former UB faculty member who is an associate professor of architectural history and criticism at the University of Texas at Austin School of Architecture. Again, Mr. Adjaye, congratulations. And to all of today's participants, please accept my best wishes for a most productive and engaging conversation. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Satish. And congratulations, Dr. Adjaye.
Thank you, Paul.
And we'll now revert to David and Bob and Charles. Thank you for joining us. This is a kind of first for the State University of New York. You are the first architect to be so honored. And I guess there's a kind of a symbolism to that that is related to an aspiration that I know I share with the faculty here, that architecture take a more significant role in the academy, that its position has, I think, often been conflated with professional preparation and academic exploration, but not at a level that research universities often respect a great deal. Your accomplishments, both in practice and research, have set a stage or a context within which architecture strives to become full member in the academy, and as such, perhaps better serve professionally the constituencies and clients that come to us. So all of that sets a context for a few questions, and I think the notion here is not interrogation except in the most academic way. So, and it's meant to be a conversation. So Charles, please chime in as we go as well. I'm hopeful between your practice and academic work, David, and Charles's deep dives into the history of architecture and particularly the way it shapes a kind of the way the infrastructure of architecture, the way the practice of architecture is structured, shapes conclusions in spaces and places that are not particularly consistent with the values that we espouse. So with that, I want to start with that relationship between architecture and racial justice and social equity that's exploded in the last few years, but has clearly been part of our context for the decades that we have been studying and practicing architecture. Both the world of practice and the academy have a kind of renewed urgency. The dismantling of canons to reconstruct more inclusive narratives in built environments seems like it's on everybody's plate. The question for you, David, is how does your approach to practice, and particularly I note research is highlighted on your opening page of your website, how this research and practice play out and how the structure of practice enables or compromises that?
Thank you. I think that you said so many things in that opening statement that are so systemic, and really the agency for which the interest in architecture that I have sort of been engaged with. When I started to look at architecture, I really saw nothing when I looked at it as a profession until I started to engage the structural issues that I felt were fundamental to the way in which it was propelling in the world. When I was a young architect, the sort of conversation about deconstruction of postmodernism seemed very kind of irrelevant and strange to me. A sort of strange theoretical abstraction that had nothing to do with the real on-the-ground experiences. I grew up with a disabled brother who was disabled from 1 year old. He was 1 and became mentally and physically handicapped. And I saw within that experience of life how structurally inefficient the world was. From the 70s, it's only really in the 90s or sort of the 21st century did we start to really deal with the issue of just access. But that was a tipping. And that really, I think, started this idea of research. I had no interest in research just because I want to be an academic. It just felt as though there simply was not enough information about other ways of looking at the world and other knowledge systems, and also facing head on some of the structural issues that were just baked into the academic architecture. So research really is a device, and it's amazing what the academy does. Research is really the deep dive to reanalyze, to rethink, and to also evaluate, to do a sort of post, not an occupancy, but it is a kind of occupancy, a post-occupancy evaluation through the lens of history and the past, to really test whether the propositions that were proposed in the built environment actually hold through, and held true for all citizens, essentially.
Lovely, lovely. If we think about that position, Charles, maybe you'd like to comment on where we are in the academy relative to practice as you see it in this family of observations.
Well, I think that David's comments are interesting, both for the pragmatism that gets covered over, for the celebration of monumentality, the celebration of kind of spectacles and event spaces, which I think is a common thread when historians have analyzed why certain groups, particularly women and social minorities, join the profession and what they're trying to do in their immediate spaces. But I think at an even larger scale, for me, the very disciplinary language that we inherit, is very culturally specific. It comes from a kind of European Enlightenment tradition, and that frames the world in narrow ways. And so I really appreciated Sir David Adjaye's comments on the peculiarity of the postmodernist discourses within architecture, if only because during that same period, there was a lot of work done that was actually culturally exploratory. And the idea of form and heterogeneity and experimentation and expansion was culturally specific in many other discourses. But in architecture, we tended to formalize things, abstract things, make it easier to sort of, for the architect as designer, to monumentalize at a distance. And so I think I really appreciate the immediacy of what he's suggesting. And at least from my own reading, what I've always found both fascinating and commendable about the research wing of Sir David Adjaye's office are the ways that he's able to inflect the vernacular into the contemporary and the monumental. And they're not this kind of bifurcated, separated elements where one is pre-modern, one is relevant to the world today, one is stuck in the past and not to be referred to, one is sort of, for the future and for utopian projection, but there's a continuum. And I think that kind of view of vernacular architecture, of material culture, but particularly of the culture that comes from Africa and the African diaspora, has helped us today to think of those arts in different ways, in ways that were different from the modernist period and even the postmodernist period, that I think has freed us in a way. So I'm really excited for this kind of work and the work of other African diaspora producers and African-American architects. I think that there's a recalibration here that could only, for me, become richer and deeper as we move forward.
Perhaps to both of you, I would ask, in the same way that we problematize the postmodern education we had and the way we addressed the abstractions of architecture and then brought it into the current discussion as you just outlined, Charles, there's also been a sort of friction between what the academy thinks is important to do and what the profession thinks is important to do. Each governed by a set of structures trapped in historical frame with a set of expectations associated with it that miss the target of an inclusive and equitable society and culture. So how does that conversation shape up today in your different perspectives? David, you might start.
Gosh, I mean, the summary that you made is the context from which, a lot of, it's interesting. The summary you've made is the context from which the beginnings of this work that we're now discussing formed its criticality, its agency, as a way of identifying the structural failure of these two positions. Sort of radicality for me is about understanding kind of positions that are not understood within the canon as it's understood at that time, and then offering illumination, and hopefully example, which then illuminates a kind of a sort of a view, a lens onto this way of seeing the world and realizing how deficient we were without it, So for me, the sort of, the radicality is about that. Negotiating, always the way in which the academy and the profession work, which is always by a sort of a default, sort of latent consensus. It's a consensual machine, which means that it's really hard for it to be nimble in the way that the individual and the profession, the person that is actually at the forefront of decisions which are about how one makes a career as an architect. What does it mean to become an architect? Faced. And for me, that question, during my career was everything. What exactly was I doing? And if I couldn't answer that, the idea of architecture was not interesting. It simply was not interesting.
Lovely. Charles?
Your question makes me think about historians who have tried to go back and reconstruct the birth of our profession. And there are many births, right? Like there's literally the practice of being an architect at a time period or in a place when there was no label for architect. There were just people making things. But in the United States, there's an interesting history where the professionalization of architecture is really a narrowing of expertise, taking everything that was happening on the construction site and limiting it to the act of drawing and sublimating that so that one could sort of take drawing spaces, turn it into a salon or studio, and bring the wealthiest people into that space. And it just so happened that in the late 19th century, these were, white, male, Anglo-Saxon Protestant folks, and there was a racialization of our profession. And as I'm looking back now, trying to reconstruct the parallel fields of expertise that were there, what I find interesting is that women had a kind of space within placemaking and architecture that went a little beyond interiors. It was actually engaged with field work, visiting rural territories, making plans to modernize the interior home. African Americans had spaces as Black master craftsmen. And this was something that wasn't formalized and professionalized in the same way that the architect was professionalized at this time period. So for me, our profession can only benefit from a more inclusive portrait of the past. We actually lose a lot of experimentation and expertise by only focusing on the path of the licensed architect. But if we go back and we say, before this bifurcation occurred, what was happening and who was making things and what kind of cultural traditions did they borrow from? I think we could probably follow those lines of development to the present. And we probably could find a lot of folks in Black communities, in gay and queer communities, in communities of color that don't commission an architect per se, engaged in this really interesting experimental work. And so for me, I think academically, I see a push to pluralize that particular discourse, not just to sort of, post facto to provide a label of architect to others, but to understand the parallel forms of authorship, and perhaps even the collaboration that occurs between those types of fields. And for me, I think that relates to what I mentioned earlier in terms of recalibrating what the vernacular means and not stereotyping that, in a sense, which I think is really important in our academic space, in our professional discourses.
When we speak of these abstractions, the labels we give ourselves, academics, professionals, architects, it kind of belies the sort of built world we live in. I'm not saying this very well, but I'm wondering about how both of you would situate the practice of placemaking broadly conceived, to borrow a word or a phrase that might not necessarily be steeped in the academy or the profession, but that attempts to address the kind of collaboration you just framed for us, Charles. We think about a world that's already built and has been evolving in urban and rural condition for centuries and centuries, thousands of years perhaps. And in that mix, we're coming with a new way of thinking about place making. And yet we have to still dwell in the world that's made before us. So what are the adaptive strategies that we take with the existing conditions we're in as architects, and how do we understand more fully the narratives that you're describing in practical ways that really make each new addition architecturally, if you will, each new artifact, adding to the conversation that enriches the understanding of what a world can be and how to understand that what's inherent in it. So, David, you mentioned that, and quoted as, we ignore the power of symbols at our peril, something I think we all can identify with immediately. But those symbols are out there, they're ubiquitous, they're everywhere. And how in the world can we not ignore them? I mean, it's how do we bring it forward in some fashion that is as constructive and hopeful as Charles suggested?
No, it's you know, when I hear it like that there's a kind of, it's overwhelming the amount of built form and symbols that are actually created. I always say, well, that means we've just got a lot of work to do.
We got some renovation to do.
That never frightens me, because I think that you know, I think one of the most exciting things about understanding that everything is about time and there's nothing static, you know, to borrow a sort of an you know, a sort of a physics idea, that actually the city is forever dynamic. And to understand it as a living dynamic system that continually has to be rebuilt, I think, is to then fully understand and embrace the idea that there is no, you know, there is no fear of what has been done, but there is always a questioning that has to happen. You know, I really think that has to be the mindset, because that is the only mindset from which, if you decouple yourself from sort of, you know, sort of crazy capitalism, so to jump into that, where we just think that if we built it, that's the end of it, to move away from that and to think of the city as a very powerful symbol that is continually remaking the citizens that inhabit it and reframing their perspective of their future. So as a result, you know, it is absolutely incumbent on those of us that are makers and those of us who are in power, who are lawmakers, to continually be rethinking how this system actually impacts, both as a collection of symbols that are, you know, right down to the way in which a street is made, to, you know, courthouse, to the image of the city. You know, and I think that in the 21st century, we're actually even questioning what is the city now. You know, with all the kind of precipices that we've entered and edged to because of, you know, the sort of rampant capitalism that we have. You know, I'm not trying to be political, but I'm just saying that, We have to find a way to always question, in a way, to make the best city for everyone, not even the most, for everyone. I mean, it's a kind of hopeless, hopeful task.
It's interesting to me, the role of architecture and in our school, planning and real estate development. I mean, you try and get that all in the same sentence, and then you understand that you are in this university. I have 12 deans to work with, and when they now more often invite architecture to the table in research investigations of one kind or another, they are often because the single discipline can't do it. It takes the integration of the architect. I want to ask Charles if there's a question embedded in that observation and what Sir David just offered that could push the role of civic architecture question forward.
For me, it's really interesting because I think there's a kind of paradox for me in the role that the architect is compelled to play. So one is that as a kind of historical figure of importance, someone who crystallizes ideas and brings them into physical form. This person is asked to kind of be this leader, this foregrounded person, and almost an elite figure separate from all of us. And especially in America, we have this culture of creating celebrities of particular figures from Frank Lloyd Wright on down, which I think actually, I know that people criticize a lot, but I think it actually could be advantageous, because I think that there are conversations that people will have with those figures that they will not have with other folks, and those realms tend to be separated. So then it presents this ethical responsibility onto these figures to be doing what we're saying here, which is to see the city in its fullness and to be speaking to people of all shapes and sizes, not just the decision makers, not just the money makers. And within capitalist structure, that's a real challenge in terms of who gets to monopolize your time and who you seem to be most beholden to in that process. But for me, the architects who I find the most interesting are the ones who, while being able to satisfy those things and to bring a high level of craft to the work, see beyond that and can see the broader range of folks who need to be involved. At least with the African diasporic architects that I'm thinking of that have really come into presence and visibility since the 2000s, they bring a cultural background and a richness that I think is just sorely missing in our profession. And they're compelling us, even from the contemporary side, to rehistoricize. And so I'll just mention very quickly one historical example of where I see this happening, or saw this happening. It's in Harlem, when it was known as the capital of Black America in the Harlem Renaissance. We have Vernon Tandy, who was the first African-American graduate from Cornell University. He's working with Madam C.J. Walker, who, when you look at her entire life, has used the home as a kind of mixed-use space for business, for philanthropy, for art. She finally gets enough money to be able to formalize this. And at least in my view of things, she helped to construct the actual figure of the new Negro that Vernon Tandy was able to materialize in his architecture. So you look at her Harlem brownstone, when you look at Villa Lawaro, to me, that's a collaboration between two forms of Blackness, both elite, one from the entrepreneurial side, one from the architectural side, that was heavily informed by the organic practices of art that were emerging at the time period. And I think, you have a healthy culture when those things continue to happen, and they happen organically, and there are those opportunities to get engaged in. And for me, I think that's the kind of back and forth and the ethical responsibility that I would say the architect has if they're doing it well. If they're not, then they'll speak in terms of technology, progressive Western civilizational narratives, the avant-garde, like these kind of shorthands that we have for you're a special person, right? You're you're a genius, you're unique. But I think there's a social responsibility there that needs to ground that work. And when it's there, I think then we get the broader conversation. So we know, because it's not just architects saying that that's a special place and it's doing something special for our culture. And so I just feel like this influx of African diasporic architects is compelling us as a discipline to do this better.
Are you finding yourself agreeing with that set of statements, David?
Yes, I'm loving the way Charles looks at the world, and I'm enjoying it very much. But I think that he's absolutely articulating very precisely exactly what I think is absolutely happening. It for me is a kind of this community being allowed to become, I think in the last 20 years to emerge as voices that have criticality, has kind of, as it were, pollinated or repollinated the field, and has kind of, to be very agricultural about it, has turned it from a monoculture into a diverse ecology, which in the end is only healthier for everyone, which is what we're trying to get to, right? We're trying to get to a diverse ecology.
Do you see structural impediments in the mechanics of practice to precisely this kind of co-production?
I think that it is the very nature of practice, which is habit, personality, familiarity, that are the very impediments that stop this evolution from taking place. Because the problems that are always cited are the dismantling of cultures and the reconstructing of new cultures as exhausting, and what are these worth taking for the disruptions that they create? And I think that that's the inherent problems in both the profession and the academy. And I think that if it's just spoken about, it gets dismissed, but it has to be tangibly. I think that the agency that's occurring now is because I think the communities that have benefited from that status quo are now seeing that they're in danger of losing their advantage if they stay within their position. So there is a shift in the sand that has occurred, which is now compelling this conversation to be beyond just the ethical and the moral sort of right thing to do, but to becoming one which is about the kind of survival for relevance. Because the pollination has happened, the harvest is coming.
I'm thinking about the metaphor of pollination, and I'm thinking about the structure of capital and power, and who engages us in these acts of placemaking and co-production that would, if it could, share power more widely. And I'm wrestling with the tension in that, and admiring a lot those who have captured the notion that our relationship to place, our ability to love a place, is also tied to our ability to love each other in place. And that those things together are working at odds with some idea of a more small c Catholic engagement of the public who is part of this placemaking enterprise, but not often empowered to play. And the architect isn't the person that gets to say that, and take that as a question, as opposed, or a questionable assertion. What is the role of the architect given the service and serve dynamic of the market they work in?
I mean, I think that there's an interesting paradox that's emerging here in terms of the historical role of the architect and monumental architecture to serve power and to serve as kind of image of stabilizing power relations. So even within our US context, the capitalist history of the US, we celebrate things like the Flatiron Building, for, you know, representing the ascendancy of America as a kind of global international power, having wealth and privilege in and of itself. But then, you know, if we look even further, if we go back to, you know, the École des Beaux-Arts and literally the state-sanctioned role of the architect to establish a kind of code, a canon for the dissemination of a quote-unquote universal architecture. And these architectures are always encapsulated within a bid for power. And so architecture is both a tool of the state, but can also be a disruptor of those things. But the disruption, I think, becomes the difficult part. It's always like the clever subversion. It's always the kind of criticality of what's happening there, beyond the obvious role of who commissioned it and for what purpose. And so, at least for me, in a capitalist context, that's a really clever, delicate art. And you can be sort of like, and I won't name names, but you could be a pragmatist, or you could just throw your hands up and say, you know, I can't do anything against these forces, you know, I'm just here to make my own individual name. Or you could recognize that, at least within American society, we've always had that subversion. We've always had that little bit that's there, but we don't tend to historicize it and put it in surveys, because then it kind of tells people what the codes are, and it tells people, like, you know, the ways that we kind of disrupt those processes. So I think, like, there's a kind of people's history of architecture that has yet to be told, where these things are happening and these people are doing these things. Sometimes it's bracketed by the architect or the urbanist. Other times it comes up organically from them and we learn from them. But I do think that within a capitalist context and settler colonial context, when you have a people who are not the majority and are even an oppressed minority, and they continue to make music, make clothing, make food, make sound and dance, and celebrate their humanity, it's going to be there. Placemaking is going to be there. And so it just requires us to be open, have our eyes open to see how that space is authored as well. And I think that, you know, I have this suspicion that architects know how this is happening, because they're talking to all types of people, and they know how to present to one group what they want to hear, and to another group what they need to hear. So there's a kind of simultaneity that's there that I think, you know, they're managing that paradox. And it's just, how do we extract that knowledge, and how do we provide it as a record for others who come after us?
I can't remember who, a teacher of mine, you know, that's a very young architect, said, you know, as an architect, you actually look down two bottles, but you have to kind of learn how to focus into each one. I can't remember the teacher's name, but I never forgot that statement about looking at two lenses as a professional.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
To me, that's a bit like an ocular notion of double consciousness, this idea of like having to see and never quite being able to verge those two places together. But yeah, oh, that's really interesting. I want you to find out who said that. That's a great quote.
I never forgot the quote, but I forgot the teacher.
So Sarah Ruddick has a book called Maternal Thinking, which suggests that you look at the child as they are and attend to those needs today. Like, no, you're not going out in the road, and you teach them how they might be in the future and create options for self-agency within that, so you can go in the road under certain complex circumstances. It strikes me that that's what we're talking about. How do we dance with the kind of capitalist structure that support and sustain us in the current system, and simultaneously change it? So holding on to that double focus and the dance of language that Charles was articulating seems to me to be a kind of pedagogical imperative in the academy, and a kind of practice norm if we're going to continue the progress we've begun to see in opening the field to a wider set of interpretations about who makes place and with what consequence. I am really challenged by this co-production. a sense I have similar to Charles's is it always is co-production. We never do it by ourselves. There's a much broader set of capacities that than we teach, but that if we embrace in the academy the idea that it has consequences beyond our teaching and invite those voices in the co-production, that really puts us in the academic environment in all the disciplines. And I struggle with the opportunity to do something like that in the modest productions and makings that are part of the everyday life of an architect. Have you got a way of working that opens those conversations that way, David?
It's looking for the code, right? Looking for the code. Of course, I have a methodology and a way of working, and it is always this bridging, tendency. A couple of questions. I think that in the academy, to prepare an architect for the world that they face, I think is to really confront them at that training stage with this dilemma, this fundamental paradox that is going to be at the core of what they are doing as they move forward. I think that I really believe that's the responsibility of the academy to at least infuse the question into the idea of becoming an architect. And it doesn't matter how it's, there are many ways of doing it. You can do it through a technical process, do it through a philosophical process, or both. But it has to somehow appear as the kind of crack in the apparent utopia of this profession. And it has to be something that can't be answered by the academy, but is really the idea of the future architect. I think there's a kind of, we have this very, slightly messianic role, if you want to sort of, play it, whereby, we understand that we work within these forces, but we're continually trying to reshape at our best, And so how do we prepare the sort of rookie architect to understand the sort of meditation of that question? I think is a fundamental, part of their education. And then for me, I was lucky enough, I think, to have, professors who really could see that I had a different slant. For my degree, I proposed at a time when nobody talked about it, a sort of respite community for disabled people in the inner city. And that was in the 80s, when literally they didn't even exist. And, some people thought this was a silly project, and the other professors were blown away that this was even being put on the table. And I ended up winning, the national award, and, it started my whole journey into architecture. But I think that this idea that, this idea of finding the mechanism to encourage the exploration of that question is important in the academy, right? Charles, do you think? I said it probably 3 times.
I agree.
Ways. Yeah.
Well, it makes me think of where we get this kind of Beaux-Arts studio culture from, and the function of the single genius within the studio the studio environment under the patron, who is the sort of aesthetic genius, and the ways that people from Catherine Anthony and others have tried to challenge that by complicating that, by either having the studio person co-teach with people. So what does one see when they're not doing a kind of visual travelogue of the world, but they're out there with an ethnographer, for example, or they do a bit of reading in cultural history, and they look at novels and plays and movies from a particular cultural tradition, and then go to that site. And it's different from the ways that we would abstract it within our Enlightenment discourses. I think that there are ways, as David is suggesting, complicating that vision. So it's not so pure, not so abstract, not so instrumental, but it's understood as a kind of collaborative force. Like as you're saying, like you're engaged in these things, you're riding that wave, but then you're seeing where it can go. That's slightly different than where it goes originally. And I guess the last thing I'll say is like, maybe one of the most important things we can do is to simply name these things and to identify them as a thing in the room. Because like, as we were talking about the forces of capitalism, I know like in a school that teaches both urban design, architecture, and real estate, one can acknowledge the coexistence of real estate speculation and private property alongside so-called communal practices like social security or corporate welfare. Like we literally live with them both. And the way the city develops is because we've learned to merge those two systems. But we tend to talk about it in historiographical terms as if it's just capitalism that's pushing the force, when in actuality it's not. It's a back and forth. It's a kind of synthesis of different types of ideologies operating simultaneously. I think if we can, from my side anyway, when I've been able to get students to be able to name it, and they have a critical vocabulary that's a bit richer than the traditional story, then you have 12 minds looking in all these different directions, instead of just the studio head who's saying, this is the frame, the intellectual frame. And for me, that's really productive when you get that intellectual space of co-discovery, and they can be precise and they can own it. They can own that vocabulary.
It's fascinating that you and I, Charles, live in a world of academic pretension. and to a very large extent, it's a pretension of separation. And what you're advocating for is the cohesion of the kind of collaborative construction that you just outlined.
But from an intellectual perspective, like I think there is something to be gained from the elitist status of the architect. And I think there is something to be gained from intellectual isolation if what you do during that time is not just play with form, but you actually try to provide a critical vocabulary and a critical understanding of what is happening. So for me, the best academics, like the best architectural teachers, studio professors, history professors, were those who were able to articulate it in such a way that it just seems obvious. And they distilled it down to this crystallized way of seeing. And now you look at the world and it's completely different, and you can name it and you can understand why it's going in that direction, versus those who tend to introduce you to many skill sets and help you to refine those skill sets, but they can't quite say, why is it useful? They just know that it's like the central thing that you need to do as an architect, and that's a different skill set. But to me, that's around the level of craft and skill building versus the kind of analytical precision that I hope for an intellectual to have, so that you can both be an intellectual within the profession, the field. But progressively, I'm seeing a public intellectual, people entering this space where they're talking architecture with the public and beholden to the canon, but also to a whole other host of constituencies and publics. That's when I get really excited, when you have somebody who can be both precise but broad. And that's a heavy lift, I think, on the intellectual side. And as much as it requires an architect to train and to really understand what's possible within a budget, what opportunities are there, what forms can visualize the kind of complex social phenomena that exists, we need intellectuals who can help us to develop precise language and frames. And I think that, at least in that sense, I would hope that we don't become too pragmatic within the intellectual sphere, and we lose that kind of opportunity to think critically on our own.
Both of you have been masterfully dancing around the kind of duality we find ourselves in, and it's really not a duality. It's a multiplex. The vectors are enormously variant. I wonder, as a kind of concluding set of observations, whose language is it? When we construct these languages and we profess them, as opposed to building them in place. Chris Alexander's old work was about those languages coming from the place as opposed to being laid on the place. And I'm struck by the mastery of your work, David, and Charles, your interpretations of history that simultaneously would, if they could, and I think this is a quote, smash the canon, and at the same time actually embrace it and interpret it and love it for what it is, but question it always. And then the other part of that is, whose question is it? And where do we place the expert with this pretense in the world we live in? I think about teaching school in this city, in Buffalo, with a community in distress all around us. And it's very clear to me they're not our laboratory. That's where we live. And so how can I teach this kind of plural understanding of where language needs to come from as we make decisions and how we think critically about place? And creating the conditions where that vocabulary comes from the publics that we are working with, as opposed to that we bring to them, or perhaps both. And what's the role of the expert in all of this is really what I think we're dancing around. So maybe a parting shot from each of you on that question. What's the role of the expert in the context of the social equity and distress we experience in cities all over the world and in rural areas all over the world?
Well, Charles, let me attempt, and then you can actually finish it properly. I think that the expert is critical. I mean, he's a kind of, at his worst, as we said, a destructive inhibitor, or at his best is an incredible synthesizer of the condition. I think that the expert is no longer set, for me, the true expert is the disruptor, the radical character that is not just about radicality for its own sake, but truly understanding how to kind of, dance between the idea of the information from the place, the Christopher Alexandrian sort of idea of reading place. My problem with just reading place is that that's not enough. That's kind of not enough because that already happens. And there is a kind of, for me, there is something in the act of architecture that insists on an author. There is always this idea that somehow, and this is maybe controversial, but I think that the idea of architecture itself is the idea of the author. It is about an author. I mean, and the author can be as complex and as mysterious or as mischievous as possible. But I think that the author is, in the end, the whole aura of why architecture is architecture. For me. So I think that I don't think we're getting to a place where we're just simply seeing the expert as a synthesizer of information. But I think we're seeing the author or the expert as a character that is able to read the landscape of the condition and is able to use that information to offer new possibilities of seeing that exact condition. Mm-hmm. Why do you need to make it again if it already exists? And what does that again do for future generations? And I think that there's something in that act that is fundamentally important to our evolution as a species, which is why we do it.
Lovely. Charles?
So let's say we take this as a premise and we think of the architect in that way. To me, then, my concern would be the limit on language that the discipline gives us, the poverty of language that the discipline gives us to acknowledge what is sort of a kind of Enlightenment Eurocentric discourse versus what it's not. And so, I could buy that premise, I guess, if our current role in this contemporary moment is to not only continue that role of authorship that the architect has been doing within this Western tradition, but also to expand the language by which we can understand and interpret
100%.
what it is that we're doing. Because I think then there's probably a wealth of experiences, both from, in a phenomenological way, from the viewer who comes into that space, like for example, St. Peter's in Rome, something like some place that's so old and ancient that it has an antiquity, but also has a present for itself, and understanding how that space is remade by the changing of our times, and then the potential of new architectures to be able to produce that. I think that what we have as a discipline is a poverty of languages to identify anything that other than what comes from the architect as the
100%.
And I think if we can expand that, then we can
Yes.
keep that perch. But for me, if we're not dedicated to that, then I'm very willing to challenge that kind of monopoly, just because I don't think that language is sufficient to the requirements of our time. And this isn't even just from an ethical standpoint, but just understanding what places are doing. Because I feel that from the Afrofuturist to the experimental queer homemaker, there are people remaking their spaces in really radical ways. It's just that there isn't a language to translate into our mediums. And if our generation just expands that even just a little bit, I think that would be a tremendous contribution to our discipline in and of itself.
I couldn't say, just to quickly add to that, because I think that you fundamentally hit exactly what it is, because I think the challenge is not to stay in that position, but to absolutely bring a new body, to add to the body of knowledge that already exists. It's not interesting to play in the arena that we know, but to keep expanding it. So I thank you for that, Charles. Thank you for.
We have reached our time, but I want to express my sincere gratitude to both of you for a lovely conversation.
Thank you both. I appreciate it.
You have framed the idea that what we're doing is building language with a host of other expert types, including local experts. And there's a kind of symmetry of ignorance in play. The architect by themselves is caught in one element of that ignorance. Our constituencies that we would work with and hear better are caught in another. But if we can construct a language that speaks across it, we have a different way of thinking about what making means and what its contributions are to the rest of the world. So we have placed the profession in a field of professions with an obligation to build language with those who are affected by what they do. And similarly, we have an academy that's now being invited to embrace architecture and planning and real estate and those who would make the world in terms of idiosyncratic expertise and try and understand the collection of things that bring us a better world. So both of you have given us new ways to think about that, and I'm grateful to both of you for this time. And Dr. Adjaye, congratulations again on being our first and a very high bar for future architects in the Academy of Honorary Doctorates of Humanities. So thank you both. Last words?
Yes, thank you. And again, congratulations. It's wonderful to have a conversation with you here.
Likewise, Charles. It's been very enjoyable. Thank you so much to your incredible academy, and thank you so much for the award. And I hope that we will meet in person soon.
Excellent. We look forward to having you here in person. That would be wonderful. Thank you both again, and thanks to the university for the opportunity to honor you in this way. And enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you for the time.